Hi, my name is Rebecca Leib. I'm with Granby in Los Angeles and Sunrise Movement. I'm asking the City Council to stand with the ILWU and with working people. I speak for the Sunrise Movement when I say that we won't tolerate appointees of the Garcetti administration who exploit the public sphere of climate change in order to justify corporate greed. Stop gentrifying environmentalism. Mayors is greenwashing automation, preying on heuristics and emotion, much in the same way as the mayor's flashy yet hollow version of the Los Angeles Green New Deal. Real climate justice protects labor, it creates jobs, it protects jobs, and it makes the air safe for those workers to breathe. The choice between labor and the environment is a false choice, and we need a real Green New Deal in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Hey guys, this is Chris Roth here with Bushido Scroll with your weekly Knock Activism Wrap-Up. Today we're going to be talking about the ILWU showing up at City Hall today. Some very scary news recording hydrofluoric acid in both oil refineries and the air we breathe. Updates around Ben Carson's proposed changes to some housing and urban development departmental rules surrounding mixed status families. That's quite a mouthful. Our recurring segment, Cops You Guys, and then a quick update on AB 516 before we check out a couple of articles in our new reading series. How's it going, Bushido?
It's going pretty well. It was a really long week, especially with two debates in the Democratic primaries. The first one I found more interesting than the second. I ended up hosting watch parties for Sunrise Phoenix for both nights. And they both went over really, really well. It was really fun. Also, a bunch of Sunrisers in Philly were camped out in front of the DNC HQ there, demanding that we get a climate debate. Bernie Sanders sent them some pizza. The Sierra Club sent them some cupcakes. All around, it was like a big win. And the Change the Debate movement that they're fronting is having a real impact. At this point, 15 of the 20 candidates that are on the stage have taken the no fossil fuel money pledge, meaning that they won't take any donations over $200 from any PACs connected to fossil fuel companies or from executives. So they won't take any big money from fossil fuel companies, which is a really big win. Like when we started this and we said like, hey, who will pledge to be on the stage of the climate debate? Who will reject fossil fuel money? We thought we would get a couple of candidates, and instead we've gotten almost the entire field on our side, and we're also getting a lot of local candidates. Not to toot your own horn too much, but you took the fossil fuel money pledge very early in your campaign, and a bunch of other like local and down ballot candidates from across the country have taken it. So Sunrise is having a real electoral impact here, and I'm super excited to see it. From what I hear, we're going to be seeing more and more actions, and this is like going to accelerate, not just because the climate change is accelerating and the climate crisis is becoming more dire. If you've been paying attention to Europe, remember in 2003, 15,000 people died in Europe from the insane heat wave. This time around, they've already charted a couple dozen deaths in France and Spain and Italy. Paris today.
How many died last year?
No, in 2003, it was 15,000.
50. Wow.
Yeah. No, because remember, like
That's
Europe
insane.
is older. They don't have the same air conditioning that we do. A lot of older people, a lot of people who are more vulnerable had no way to like cool off, and they're not as used to having like cooling centers and stuff like we do here in the Southwest or on the West Coast.
Wasn't it? It was a couple of hundred old folks in Japan died like last year in the heat wave as well, right?
Yeah, and they're the same folks
This is the future we live in.
In Phoenix last year, over 100 people died from heat-related deaths, including a woman named Stephanie Pullman, who died because APS, one of our power utilities here, one of the private monopolies that runs a public utility, something that you and I gripe about all the time, but APS...
no, we've never talked about that.
APS cut off her power on a day when it was 107 degrees. Hold on. Over $51. She got a $176 bill. She got a $176 bill. She could only pay $125 of it. APS said that they had called her and tried to contact her before they shut off her power. When she passed away, her family went through all of the records and found that APS never contacted her. The CEO of APS, Don Brandt, makes $12 million a year, which means he makes $51 every 30 seconds. So for 30 seconds worth of his workday, a woman died. And we know that more than 100 people died last year. We're expecting more than 100 people will die this year. We know that the people who are unhoused in cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas and LA, when the heat gets really high, they're especially vulnerable. They don't have access to water, to shade, to cooling. We know in LA, LAPD makes you take down your tent after 6 a.m. So in the heat of the day, you don't have shade. You don't have any way to get out of the sun. And this is just going to keep accelerating and getting worse. But in Paris today, a bunch of Extinction Rebellion protesters blocked one of the main thoroughfares that leads to sort of the center of town and where the Notre Dame Cathedral is. They were tear gassed at point blank range by Paris police today. The video is very shocking to see because these are completely peaceful protesters. They're literally just sitting there. And like that pepper spray cop at UC Davis, a guy just walks up with a canister of tear gas and sprays it in their face. It's this kind of regressive policing that's only going to lead to more and more direct actions because this doesn't deter us. This doesn't deter people. If anything, it builds their motivation to want to fight against this stuff and save their neighbors. So this is going to be a really long, hot summer, and there's going to be a lot more actions coming. So to kind of tie this together, the Change the Debate movement and the Sunrise Watch parties, of which there were more than 100 across this nation, went off really, really, really well. So if you want to keep up to date,
one of them. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was really good. And if you want to keep up, check out sunrise.la, it's sunrise.los Angeles on Instagram, Sunrise MVMT LA on Twitter. Check out Sunrise Movement Phoenix on Instagram and then Sunrise MVMT PHX on Twitter to keep up with what we're doing here. And also just Sunrise MVMT to keep looped in with the national movement because there's a lot of stuff that's going to be happening. We need more people out there. When it comes down to it, a movement for social change has never been defeated if they can get 3.5% of the population to actively participate. That means in America, to change everything across the nation, we want 11 million people actively engaged. And we're getting there. But we're getting there by leaps and bounds, and we've still got several leaps and bounds to go. So I hope y'all will go ahead and throw in with that and at least keep apprised and do some signal boosting for us. You yourself had a really, really big day. Let's go ahead and talk about the ILWU and what's going down at the Port of LA and City Hall.
So I think Becca really summarized it best while saying that after today, she just genuinely wants to find a union and be a part of it because, oh man, was it great. So a little bit of background here of what's going on is that something like a week ago, the Port Commission, the Board of Commissioners for the Port of Los Angeles gave an automation permit to Maersk, which is the Danish transport company's subsidiary APM Terminals. APM Terminals is then using that permit to basically start automating a ton of jobs at the port in the name of electrification and environmental protection. So their whole gist with all of this is that these gigantic robotic container movers are a way that they're going to be able to move forward with electrifying and cleaning up the pollution that is produced by the movement of cargo and goods around the port.
And there is something to be said for that, as the Port of LA is one of the biggest polluters in the Southland, but it doesn't seem like they're doing this in a very fair or just way, and it seems more like an end run around the unions than actual environmental concern.
Very much so. So what ends up happening here is that the ILWU felt that they had been completely screwed over by this process because they had been. And so they appealed to try to get City Hall to get involved. And there was a motion that was put forward by Joe Buscaino from CD15, which is that long, super skinny segment of the city in this bizarre, I don't want to say it's gerrymandering because it's not really gerrymandering so much as somebody made a very bizarre map for the city of Los Angeles.
Well, but they also consciously decided to keep the Port of LA in LA because they want that revenue.
Exactly. So the Port of Los Angeles is basically like a southern outpost of the city of LA, and then they had to connect it to the rest of the city of LA. And so there's this really skinny city council district that is represented by Joe Buscaino, and it includes like Wilmington and the areas in San Pedro and all that down there at the port, and then it just runs up in this very narrow corridor along the 110 freeway. And so anyway, Buscaino partnered up with Mike Bonin, who represents CD11, to introduce a motion that would effectively assert I don't want to say dominion, but assert jurisdiction of the city of Los Angeles related to this this permit that was issued. And then following up the assertion of that jurisdiction, then they would veto the existing the existing permit that the Port Authority had granted, or not Port Authority, the Board of Commissioners rather, had granted to Maersk and their subsidiary APM terminals, and basically just say, no, you cannot do what it is that you are doing. And so it was this incredible experience to go like show up at City Hall, and there were protesters all over the place because the union folks showed up in force. It was so packed at City Hall that the fire marshal was literally not letting anyone into the main City Hall chambers. And if you've ever been to City Hall chambers, it's a pretty big space. There's a lot of room in there for folks to gather. I think it's like a 350 or 400 person capacity inside. And the police were just, the LAPD and the fire marshal literally were just saying, no, you can't come in. I had to wait for a while to be able to get in myself, but ended up being able to get in there eventually, and it was it was pretty cool to see. I've never seen City Hall that packed before, and they were very well disciplined in terms of when they were cheering and shouting. Yep. And it everything went off in a very controlled manner. It was much more calm and collected than what I've seen when there have been more contentious issues. Like when two sides of a debate are showing up to argue at City Hall, it's a different story. But this was purely a single side on an issue that showed up, and they very much had all of the folks from City Council on their side. It was a unanimous vote in the end. And a lot of very impassioned speeches from both the members of council as well as all of the folks that came to give public comment. We had two folks who are ground game members as well as members of Sunrise Los Angeles who were able to get themselves onto the speaker queue to give public comment, and were able to get up there and talk about the fact that what Garcetti is talking about when he is discussing a Green New Deal in Los Angeles is really a half-baked version of what a Green New Deal actually entails.
Yeah,
and they were able to get up there.
Becca's quote about there being a divide between labor and environmental justice being a false choice is so on the money. Like, that is pretty much everything in one quote.
Baby. Exactly. So what it really came down to was that Becca and John got up there and talked about exactly what it means to include a just transition, which is a core element of the Green New Deal that we're talking about all the time. And the fact that Garcetti ignored it when he was talking about what he wanted to do and this future that he envisioned for shutting down the gas plants in Los Angeles, which we celebrated the idea of shutting these down because we need to shut them down. We need to move away from a fossil fuel energy future. But at the same time, we need to protect the workers whose jobs and families' financial security is dependent upon those factories and gas-fired power stations continuing to operate. So we cannot just shut things down and expect people to just like pick up and move on to something else. We need to make sure that there is a way for them to transition from those previous fossil fuel or extractive technology industries into something where it's a green energy solution that is truly a sustainable future for our species and our cities and states, like that we definitely are keeping in mind a more holistic approach to this than what it is that Garcetti was pushing.
And this is also something that, like, has always struck me as weird when I'm talking to labor folks about the Green New Deal, and they're like, "You're going to cost us jobs," and it's like, when you look at how a coal mine that's owned by like a billionaire shuts down, they don't provide job security once that mine is no longer profitable. They just shut the mine. Like North Dakota had a huge problem where they had a boom for a few years and brought in a whole bunch of jobs, and then as soon as those oil wells were no longer profitable, those jobs just stopped happening, and there was no money paid to the workers who were now out of a job who were like basically displaced from that industry. A lot of folks like ended up in North Dakota and then couldn't leave because their only source of income just up and disappeared on them. And that's literally the opposite of what the Green New Deal is trying to achieve, whether it's through job training, whether it's through mitigation and cleanup efforts, whatever it is. We want to provide a future for people who are no longer working in oil and gas and like dirty jobs. It's not like, hey, you've been an oil and gas worker and now we want you to just like languish in retirement and have nothing to do. It's like, no, there are productive ways for us to use your skills to fix the planet, to better society, better yourselves.
We've got shit to do, dude.
Yeah. If you watch that Letter from the Future video that AOC put out, like she talks about that. And that's the vision that we're putting forward. And instead we see companies like Maersk who only want to pad their profit margins, and they know that like keeping union workers on, retraining workers, getting people new skills is not going to make them as much money because that means money is going to workers instead of profits.
Yeah.
And Maersk is
to quote really quick, to quote the comrade Mike Bonin, the forces of international capital are trying to divide the environmentalists from labor. But continue.
Right on the money, like 100%. What we're seeing is the folks who only want profit know that us having solidarity is going to cut into their profits because we're going to dismantle their businesses for the better. So, like, I'm really excited to hear about the union power that was built there. Also to hear, city council always votes in lockstep, but, like, this is one of the times when it was, very symbolic and meaningful and, like, really cool.
Yeah.
And, like, don't forget, there's power in a union. There's a reason the Koch brothers want to gut all the unions.
Yeah, there were people like the level of energy in that room. Like people were literally crying about what was going on because of the impact that this could have on their future. Like there's a guy that runs a pizza shop that showed up, and when he was talking about like what's their most popular pizza, it's the Longshoreman pizza. There was a huge roar of support from this entire hall filled with union folks. Like it was intense. The level of energy was honestly infectious. It was an incredible experience. So, and the short version of what ended up happening is that there was a lot of discussion. Mike Bonin made a bunch of very good technical points explaining why what the port, the Board of Commissioners for the port had done was not in compliance with the rules, and allowing the city of Los Angeles to assert their authority. That's a fun little tongue twister. Asserting their authority relating to the fact that it is public space that belongs to the city, and it is through their eventual. It's all coming down to the fact that the city owns the property. It's for the public good, and for that reason, all of the things that the Port Authority or the Board of Commissioners, I keep screwing that one up, the Board of Commissioners for the Port of Los Angeles were considering was done incorrectly because they were taking a look at it from purely environmental perspectives instead of actually having to discuss it on the economic impact of what it was going to have for the city as well as for the local community. Yeah. And basically the whole thing was that they found a way to have this great technicality overturning of what had happened, and it was a thrilling experience to be a part of that and to be able to sit there and watch what was happening and cheer them along as it was going on. It was great.
That's a huge
highly
win.
Recommend it. Yeah. Unions are amazing.
No, it's a huge win, but it's also something we're going to have to be on the lookout for because Maersk has shown that they don't want to play by the rules anyways. So they're going to still try and get around this, and they're still going to try and assert their authority. So I know this fight isn't over, but like this was a very meaningful battle, and the side of justice won. fun.
Yeah, it was honestly like all of the speeches, all of the discussions, all of the cheering. It was fantastic. There's lots of videos. We'll be posting stuff over the course of the rest of the weekend.
Yeah.
It was good. Wish you all could have been there because, like Becca said, everyone should join a union because it sounds amazing.
No, that's cool. Let's move on to talk about some other dirty jobs because this is not the only environmental labor kind of conflict that's going on right now. So let's start this off by talking about what went down in Philly, which was a super scary situation.
Oh, yeah. So it was early on the morning of Friday, June 21st. I think it was like 4:30 or 5 in the morning in Philadelphia. There was this massive explosion. And we're talking a fireball that was of incredible proportions. A bunch of like dash cam and cell phone videos from folks driving down the freeway that they had recorded it and they were uploading it. They were sending it off to CNN. And fun enough, the headline on CNN a couple of days later read, quote, "Giant explosion rocks largest refinery complex on the East Coast, sends gasoline prices higher." So, of course, no one's worried about what the environmental or, civic costs of having a giant explosion at a refinery in South Philadelphia might be. They're just concerned about the fact that the gasoline prices are going to be going higher, at least CNN.
One thing that's really fun about this that like very few people have mentioned in the mainstream media or in like corporate media is that even when this refinery is operating as normal, it is the biggest source of air pollution in all of Philadelphia. Like even when it's doing everything right and not bursting into flames, it is the greatest danger to human health in that entire city. Like that is so messed up that we have these things sitting in the middle of our cities, and as we'll get to in a minute, this is happening right here in LA. But let's go ahead and talk about kind of some of the dangers that Philly presented, so we can contextualize this.
We are just so good at picking out these like lighthearted topics of discussion and filling people's hearts with joy about all of the wonderful things that are happening because corporations just love to treat us all like people. Anyway, you laugh because there's nothing else you can do. All right, so the early morning fire sent shockwaves for miles and rained debris on nearby neighborhoods, sparking fears about hydrofluoric acid and the damage it could cause. Literally, could melt your entire body because it's an incredibly toxic chemical.
Yes.
And when it's vaporized, it's really, really, really bad. So what we're talking about here is a 3-alarm fire that required 120 firefighters at the Philadelphia Energy Solutions Company refinery to keep the blaze from spreading further. So this company, Philadelphia Energy Solutions, was created from a joint venture between the Carlyle Group, which is a company that you should know about if you've never heard of them before. Look them up in relation to everything that went down with Iraq and Afghanistan, and you're going to get really depressed.
Spoiler alert, it's the Bush family. The Carlyle Group is the Bush family.
We're going to start doing our own dollop stuff here in a minute. And Sunoco, which is another company. We'll dig into them later. And emerged from bankruptcy last August. Carlyle still owns 10% of the facility, and Energy Transfer Partners holds 8% of the stake, according to sources.
Where have I heard the name Energy Transfer Partners? Oh, that's right. DAPL. They're the folks behind DAPL. Not only are they trying to poison all the water, not only are they pushing native and indigenous tribes off of their land, they're also trying to blow up Philadelphia.
I mean, like, no. Why? No. Okay. So Sunoco is telling these folks that the refinery was a former facility of theirs, but that they no longer have any ties to the complex. We don't necessarily believe them.
I mean, I think they have to file stuff like that, and they say they probably still have some investment in there some way because like that money tends to get like muddled in weird ways. But to bring this home to LA and as to like why you should really care about this as somebody who lives in LA is we have two refineries that sit in the middle of our neighborhoods that use the same hydrofluoric acid process to refine gasoline. The Phillips 66 refinery up in Carson, and then the Exxon refinery, the Chevron refinery down in Torrance. Now, the hydrofluoric acid, as Chris mentioned, is super dangerous when it gets into the air because it can literally create a skin-melting fog. So if you've seen that Simpsons Treehouse of Horror with the fog that turns everybody inside out, it's that, but real life, sitting in the middle of Torrance and Carson. And this is particularly important because within about 2 weeks, that refinery in Carson had 2 massive fires, in an insane coincidence.
That's
and both of those times,
their things kept burning.
Yeah, and so those fires and the fire at the Philadelphia refinery were both linked to benzene. So it was a benzene tank that exploded somehow, and it's because of the secrecy that we grant fossil fuel companies for their quote proprietary processes, because we don't want other people stealing the way that they make the gasoline that's killing us all. We allow them to keep a lot of this hidden from the public view because it will scare the crap out of you. I notice on my Spotify, Spotify still thinks that I'm in LA sometimes, even though my phone is clearly pinging cell towers in Phoenix. But I will get ads from Chevron talking about how they're making the Torrance refinery really, really safe. And all I can think is if you're spending enough money to try and convince the public that this refinery is safe, it's probably super dangerous.
Yeah.
And this is not
not a good sign.
No, and this is not a new fight. Community groups have been fighting for years to get them to change this process. And both Phillips and Chevron have argued that it would cost too much money to stop using hydrofluoric acid, that it would cost them jobs because the engineers and the workers who are trained to work with hydrofluoric acid wouldn't be able to go over to the new process. And it's no, you could just train them. If they're smart enough to learn all the petrochemical skills to be able to refine gasoline, they could be trained in new skills. That could totally happen, and also would prevent the release of skin melting fog. And the alternative processes are proven safer. We know what the safe alternative is here. It's not one is dangerous and the other one's equally as dangerous. It's one is super dangerous and one is very much less dangerous. Let's do the one that doesn't make a skin melting fog and put up gigantic fireballs that cover a city. This is...
But Bushido, you've got to remember, that one costs more money.
I know, it's so dumb. But it's the same, and it's funny because when you listen to Chevron and you listen to Phillips and they're it's going to cost jobs, they're trying to drive that wedge between people who want a livable planet and people who want a secure and stable, source of employment. And those things aren't at odds. They're really, really not. You can have people employed and not create skin melting fog. And this was also a big thing with the bomb trains that have been outlawed going through a lot of cities, because these trains that carry chemicals to refineries, that carry the unprocessed crude, are literally bombs on wheels. And a couple of them caught fire and blew up and obliterated towns. The largest explosion in American history was an oil tanker that went off. It may have been in Canada actually, but went off in I think a bay in New York. I'm too lazy to Wikipedia this, but basically it was a bomb sitting on an ocean that exploded and leveled a town. This has happened before in American history, and we know how to avoid this stuff. We're just choosing not to. But it seems like City Council is making some pushes to do this, but it's also hard because the way that the fossil fuel industries are regulated are beyond LA's control completely. And as much as we have council members like Bonin who want to see this changed, there's only so much pressure that they can apply. We need the state and we need the federal government to come through and force these changes to happen, which again, they have the power of fiat. They could just outlaw the hydrofluoric acid process and solve the skin melting fog problem, but they won't, and probably link to all of the donations they get from fossil fuel money companies. So, yeah, that's a fun one. So remember when you're voting in the primaries and in the general election that people who don't take money from fossil fuel industry, they're good. They're very good folks. They're the folks who want to protect you from the skin melting fog.
Yeah, so let's move from that topic of extremely depressing nature to another one where we're talking about the potential for 55,000 children being made homeless because Ben Carson is an asshole.
Yeah, I was gonna let me add some context to this. So when you think about public housing, a lot of people don't know how that works, and so public housing, when you move into it, you have a guaranteed ceiling on your rent. You only have to pay 30% of your income to live in public housing, and so like if you make more money, the cost of your rent goes up. But like as long as you're making the same amount of money, the cost of your rent won't go up. This doesn't apply to people who are undocumented or live in mixed status families. So like if you have a family where one of the parents is undocumented and the other one's a citizen, that family by definition is paying 60% of their rent to live in public housing. Like these are families that are de facto rent burdened and face eviction. Like when we through Power, we worked with a woman on a cruise who was going to get evicted from her place because she finally kicked out her abusive ex-husband, and the city was like, or the county rather was like, if he's no longer here, you have to move out. And Anna was able to fight a little bit.
Yeah,
we learned that Hacla had no way to take an abusive spouse off of the lease. It also turned out that her abusive alcoholic ex-husband had been lying about his income. So when she was trying to negotiate with the county to stay there, when she was trying to negotiate with the county to stay in the house, the county... Well, yeah, the county went and audited his earnings. It was like, you've underreported your income for years. And instead of saying he's on the line for it, they were like, Anna, since you're the one who wants to live there, you're now on the line for him lying about his income for all these years. She also kicked her 21-year-old daughter, who is undocumented, out of the house to try and save the house for the rest of the family for her 3 underage children. Wasn't enough for Hacla. She ended up losing the house. We weren't able to save that one for her. But now we're facing that on a much more massive scale because HUD doesn't just want to charge these people more money. They want to kick them out onto the street. But we have some local action that's coming off to try and stop this. So let's talk about that presser that you were at.
Yeah, so on Wednesday morning, I was at a press conference that was held by Ground Game Los Angeles and people organizing for West Side Renewal. So it was a joint press conference that we held along with 6 members of the Los Angeles City Council, as well as the CEO of the Los Angeles Homelessness Services Agency, LAHSA, and the CEO of the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles, HACLA. So we apologize for the fact that there are so many acronyms in this alphabet soup of these organizations, but this is just the world in which we live, and please bear with us. Basically, we had the press conference was being emceed by one of our own folks from Ground Game, Charlie Peppers, who did a fantastic job up there on the microphone. And he introduced to the various members of City Council and also talked about how this issue hits home for him because he is living in a low-income housing apartment where the landlord was trying to push these massive rent spikes for him and all of his neighbors. It turns out, fortunately, that since that press conference, their situation has been resolved because it turns out that their landlord was operating illegally and was trying to push these increases well before the covenant was going to expire, which meant that the action was illegal. So
and the covenant issue, this is something we've talked about with the Hillside Villa tenants. Yeah. This is something that's going to be happening across LA because a lot of these housing covenants came into play in the late 80s and the late 80s and the early 90s. So we're going to be facing more and more waves of this. But the other thing about Charlie Pepper's story that really gives me hope is his building wasn't organized before this rent increase. He got to know Ground Game. He got to know Power. He's a screenwriter, and he's been using our office as part of sort of a community center to like do readings and do writing and come by and hang out. Him connecting with us showed him that it's possible to organize as tenants. Now that they're organized, they're not going to unorganize. They're not going to forget the lessons that they learned or the power that they exercised.
And now
this is why we're doing this stuff.
Them.
Like, you can seize power and make positive changes in your life. And it was really great to have him up there giving doing the MC and like hosting, as it were, because we saw some really powerful speeches, especially from the CEO of HACLA, who was literally brought to tears at the prospect of thousands of Angelenos losing their home for no reason. Like, we're facing massive spikes in homelessness, and Ben Carson's HUD wants to increase homelessness more.
Yeah, and one of the most important things to remember with all of this is that the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department is not spending a single federal dime on financing the rent and subsidizing the rent for any of these folks who have are undocumented. So evicting these families would increase the burden on the federal housing authorities, because what it means is that if you're undocumented, you end up having to pay market rate for your portion of the rent, which means that in these mixed status families, the mixed status individuals, those who do not have their proper documentation to qualify for the federal subsidies, they have to pay market rent. So if you evict the whole family, you're now losing that market rate subsidy or market rate income to the building, which then means that the federal government is going to have to pay more to whoever it is that owns that building in order to put more people into that space. So this doesn't help. This helps literally nobody. All it is vindictive bullshit coming out of the Trump administration. Nobody benefits. Literally nobody benefits. But if you read the San Francisco Chronicle, they had an opinion piece that was published yesterday or this morning that was just absolutely spewing a bunch of complete bullshit on the other side of this, saying that, this was a thing that's going to save the federal government a bunch of money. It's like, no. You fundamentally do not understand how it is that the Housing and Urban Development Department works and how the funding for public housing works. And it's a shock, I tell you, that a bunch of rich, entitled white folks from San Francisco have no idea how public housing works in this country. Absolutely shocked, I tell you.
Well, and it's amazing too when you look back at the federal government shutdown, because Ben Carson was like, "Oh yeah, no, it's fine, it's great. It's not going to affect HUD." It turns out that HUD almost ran out of money to pay Section 8 subsidized vouchers, and if they did that, there were literally landlords who knew that was going to happen and started sending pre-eviction letters to people like, "Hey, if you miss the next month's rent payment because the federal government can't fill in the gap between your income and what you owe me in rent, we're going to evict you immediately." And they knew that they could get these families out and replace them with market rate families and just make a ton more money and not care that people are ending up on the street where they're going to die. It's just this same cycle of taking housing away from people, not providing any sort of solution or alternative. And also the fact that the guy who runs HUD was so stupid that he didn't know what was going to happen. He hadn't done the math, and his own staff had to tell him, no, this is going to be really, really bad for the people that we're here to serve. Because HUD isn't supposed to be punitive, and Carson wants to run HUD in a punitive, moralizing way, where he's like, oh, if we just threaten to put people on the street or make them homeless, then that will grow their moral fiber. And it's this disgusting misreading of what his job is supposed to be, and also absolute incompetence and malfeasance in his position. I still, my mind boggles that anyone could watch Ben Carson in those GOP primary debates and think that guy should run a federal agency.
So what we're really saying here, folks, we're really saying is that Ben Carson is absolutely the single most qualified individual that the entire Trump administration has been able to find to run our entire public housing program in this country. Let that one sink in.
Yeah, and this one, I'll put the link in the description for where you can go to submit public comment to HUD to tell them to not do this.
Keep-families-together.org.
Yes, and we need to just keep submitting comments. We've got 7,000 now, and that number's grown. We want just 14, 20, 50,000, as many people as we can to get to sign this.
Exactly. So what's really fun here is that if each comment that is submitted is more than something like 30% different, the folks at HUD have to respond individually to each one, which means that if they get lazy and they decide not to respond, we can sue them. And if we sue them, we can stop them. And if we stop them, we can prevent them from evicting people and burdening our our poor communities, our immigrant communities, our mixed status families from having to deal with the fact that they're going to be evicted and put out onto the street and become homeless. And frankly, folks, that's a great freaking reason to be suing the government for this.
And having filled having filled one of these out myself,
it's not hard.
No, it's not hard, but there's also like you have your intro paragraph, and then there's a section that says insert your own comments here. And you only need to write 5, maybe 6 lines in order for that to be 30% different from the rest of them. And there's a section there that says like put your own comment in here, and you put that in there, and then it's got the same concluding paragraph. Go and do that. It'll take you like 10 to 15 minutes. If you spend a decent amount of time on it, it's not that hard. Send it in. Every comment really, really counts. And the public records laws and the fact that like this is a federal government agency means that they're ethically and legally bound to operate in a certain way. Knowing how those laws work, having knowledge of those inner workings of government gives us a lot of power. This is a really easy way to step in. Tell all of your friends to do it. Share the hell out of it on Twitter and Facebook. Ambush random people on the street with your laptop and tell them to not evict families. It's very hard to meet someone who hears like, hey, the federal government's going to evict families. Do you think that's a good idea? Most people will say, no, that's a terrible idea.
Exactly.
Except for like the most virulent, racist, and ridiculous people. But we don't really care whether they submit comments or not. Yeah. Actually, we'll talk about them right now. That's kind of harsh, but not really.
All right. Well, with that, let's move on to our recurring segment, Cops, you guys.
And before we get into that, I do promise we are getting a bumper from Ace. He just hasn't done it yet, but we're going to keep pressuring him over that. But so let's go ahead and talk about the Sheriff's Oversight Commission, which is civilians who oversee the Sheriff's Department for LA County. They have some power, but not all the power we want them to have, and they tend to get stonewalled by the Sheriff's Department, both under McDonnell and under Villanueva. But let's talk about what's been going down there, because it's also frustrating and maddening.
So we're not going to go into it in too much detail, but what ended up effectively happening is that the Sheriff's Department was supposed to be discussing what the hell had happened regarding Ryan Twyman and the fact that sheriff's deputies unloaded 34 rounds in his general direction and killed him when he was just sitting in a car in a parking lot at an apartment complex in the unincorporated portion of Los Angeles County. And during the hearing where they were talking about Ryan Twyman, as along with a couple of other shootings that had happened, because there are so many shootings that are happening, this just keeps happening. Anyway, while they were doing the discussion about Ryan Twyman, one of the activists in the room was apparently hit over the head with a sign by a white supremacist. At some point shortly thereafter, the activist seized the sign, ran back to a trash can, and threw the sign away. The sheriff's deputies then decided to detain the activist, escort the white supremacist out of the facility, shut down the entire hearing, and everything devolved into chaos. So it's just a mess. It's just a mess. And on top of all this, while this discussion was happening, while this white supremacist was apparently hitting an activist over the head with a sign, there were like 20 sheriff's cars, SUVs, that showed up at one Gateway Plaza right next to Union Station, which is the little U-shaped courtyard in front of this office building where the Sheriff's Oversight Committee holds its hearings, or some of its hearings at least. So it was a surreal experience. I actually got there just a few minutes after this all went down, and everybody's tensions were very high. I couldn't get into the room. I couldn't really tell exactly what had happened. There were a lot of discussions between lawyers and folks involved with the committee. And what ended up happening at the end of all of this was the white supremacist was already gone. The activist eventually was released from being detained. And I guess it was a no harm, no foul kind of a situation. But this is just a taste of what is to come, because the sheriff's deputies apparently just cannot stop shooting folks. So On that particular note, what happened last night, literally last night, was just before 11 p.m. 18-year-old Paul Rea became the latest victim of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Deputies stopped a vehicle in which Rea was the passenger just before 11 p.m. last night, Thursday, June 27th, on the 300 block of South Gerhardt Avenue. Deputies are claiming that the passenger in the car, which was Rea, stepped out of the vehicle and apparently started fighting with a deputy, and that he was then shot. This is just absolutely disturbing and disgusting.
Yep.
Rea's grandmother, Irene Garcia, told CBS 2, quote, "They're not dogs. Whether they're doing something bad, you shoot them and punish them after, but you don't shoot them down like a dog," end quote.
And this is one thing about this that was mentioned in that same article by the family is that Rea is like 5 feet tall and not like a big built guy. He's not like a welterweight in MMA. So the fact that he would be any kind of a threat to a sheriff's deputy who's carrying multiple non-lethals and wearing Kevlar is really quite the assertion on the sheriff's, on the deputy's like side. It's one of these where you're just kind of like, you know, it's like when cops shoot dogs because the dog barked at them and they're like, that was a threat. And the level of threat that a cop has to feel in order to kill someone is way too low. And this is something they were hoping to address with AB 392, but it got gutted. So hopefully more public pressure and more like asking of questions and demanding that these officers lose their job for this sort of behavior is the only way we're going to fix this for now, at least until Sacramento steps up and takes actual action to bring accountability to our policing.
Yeah. I mean, that's literally all we have to look forward to at this point. This is extremely depressing. This keeps happening week after week after week. And there does not seem to be any end in sight. So something's got to happen, folks. Something's got to happen.
And this is, again, you know, this is, I think by my count, it's the running count I'm trying to keep in my head. I want to say the 7th death at the hands of cops in LA County in the past 2 weeks. That's a lot of people getting shot by the cops. Like in literally the span of 48 hours, LAPD and the sheriff's department killed 5 people. 5 people in 48 hours. That's an insane amount of people being killed in that short a period of time. And like, when we look at a city like New York that has more cops and more people in it, their police don't kill nearly as many people. We can then look at a city like Phoenix that has fewer people, fewer cops, and Phoenix has the deadliest cops per capita in the nation. Like, for some reason out here in the West, especially Southern California, our police are incredibly, incredibly deadly. And these are cultural problems that have to be addressed at the top. And Michael Moore is definitely not taking care of that. Villanueva is definitely not taking care of that.
Certainly not.
No, it's disturbing, and it's something we're just going to have to keep yelling about and getting upset about, because we all should be upset about this, because this is the money that we're paying to our government being used to murder our neighbors. And once that happens, the families are faced with the funeral costs, with the costs of trying to get answers from the sheriff's department and LAPD. They get stonewalled by the police commission, which has literal billionaires on it, literal billionaires and multimillionaires who literally invest in private prisons. So we know the carceral state doesn't work. We know this isn't helping, and it keeps costing young men of color their lives. And I don't understand how that builds these communities or how that feeds these opportunity zones, as the government likes to talk about in underserved communities, like there's an opportunity there. It just is a failure of leadership at so many levels, and it largely is fed by the amount of money that our police unions have to throw at the political process. And until we stop the police unions from being able to advocate that way, we're going to see politicians that kowtow to them. And this is just going to keep getting coverage.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you can do if you are moved by this is that every Tuesday morning, there is either a sheriff's oversight committee hearing or a police commissioner hearing for the LAPD, and you can show up and see exactly what it is that we're talking about. You can see these panels of civilians who are supposed to have oversight over these law enforcement officers and agencies. And you can hear the pain and the sorrow and the just unbelievable grief from the victims of the shootings, of the families of the victims of these folks who have been just executed by the police in many instances. And you can be there and you can hold them to account. You can stare them in the face and you can demand an explanation. You're not going to get one, but you can demand it from them anyway. And it feels cathartic, but it does also, it is a very difficult experience. I've been to a number of them at this point, and you will probably be shaking after giving testimony at one of these things, because you're going to sit there and you'll see either Michael Moore or does Alex actually, Alex Villanueva, is he actually there when they're having the civilian oversight board?
He's supposed to, and I know they do show up at some, but I think that the thing that catches my eye whenever I watch the public comments is standing right next to the podium is a cop with a gun.
All the cops?
Like that's a pretty clear
one.
sight.
It's like 3.
Yeah, and they're standing right next to the podium, like they can just grab you and push you out. Yeah.
I mean, when you're in these spaces, there are literally like 5 or 6 cops on the left wall and 5 or 6 cops on the right wall, and like 4 or 5 of them on the wall behind you, as well as the chief of the police department sitting up on stage. Like it is a surreal and just kind of terrifying experience, and it is something that I don't wish upon anyone, but at the same time, if you want to come down and be a part of that, join the folks from White People for Black Lives, join the folks from Black Lives Matter, join the families of the victims of these shootings, and show them the support that they deserve and demand the justice that they deserve. And yeah.
All right, so tying that Cops You Guys edition off, we have one more depressing segment until we get into the comedy relief bit. But so let's talk about AB 516, which would stop poverty towing, or at least attempted to. But like all good ideas that go to Sacramento, it gets its guts ripped out in favor of moneyed interests.
Yeah. The quick version, and I'm kind of running out of energy, so we're not going to go into this in too much depth, but originally AB 516 was going to stop you from being towed if your car had 5 or more parking tickets, if it had been parked in the same area, the same space for more than 72 hours, or if your registration was out of date by less than 6 months. But your vehicle was otherwise legally parked, you would not be able to be towed by the city or county or whatever municipality level parking enforcement folks you were dealing with. They couldn't tow your car if you had just done one of those things, but your car was otherwise legally parked. Now, the only protection that AB 516 provides is if you have 5 or more unpaid parking tickets. The bill will now permit towing under the 72-hour rule that had been such a point of contention at the Los Angeles City Council hearing in which it was discussed. So now apparently every single member of City Council, aside from Mike Bonin, who was the only one who stood up for this, for the protection of these folks in the way that 516 was originally envisaged, everyone else can now finally get on board with 516 because the thing they complain the most about is no longer applicable. But the only thing about the 72-hour rule that is just, I don't understand exactly how this works. You'll be able to, the bill will permit towing under the 72-hour rule, but requires the local governments to provide a 5-day notice before a tow, which seems like it's more like an 8-day notice. I'm very confused as to what this is supposed to mean.
Well, and also the other thing is the 72-hour rule isn't triggered by like the city coming by and checking. It's triggered by people complaining to 311.
Somebody filing a complaint.
So, you know, it's going to be an interesting one to see how people try and get around this. People try and get stuff towed anyways. You and John talked last week about how you ran into a mother who had her window broken and LAPD rolled up and said, oh, this car isn't drivable, and towed away her home. So we know that like the powers that be are going to find ways to tow people's cars anyways. Yeah, and punish them for being poor. We'll keep you updated as this one goes on. I don't think City Council is going to change their mind on opposing 516. It would still provide some relief to people, but it's narrowing the band of people who will get protection under it. So that one is
my recollection was that they had passed the motion on 516 with an amendment, if my memory is correct, that said that they would oppose 516 unless the 72-hour rule was removed from it. So maybe they'll accept it. Maybe they won't. Who knows?
Well, we'll see. I mean, when you chatted with Marquis Harris Dawson, like that was his big thing, was the 72-hour rule. Like that was the only thing he really talked about. So we'll see. Maybe they might come and like issue a correction or have a vote to reverse their stance. We'll have to see. I mean, again, I don't think 516 is really high up on their agenda at the moment, but hopefully we'll get to see some movement.
And at least, dude.
Yeah, and at least Sacramento is trying to do something to help. They keep shooting themselves in the foot, but we'll see how that one goes forward. Let's go ahead and move into my new favorite segment, our reading series.
Me fail English? That's impossible.
So the first article I want to talk about is an article that focuses on Mike Bonin. And Mike actually said this is one of the highlights of his career, is getting called out by Susan Shelley. Now, Susan Shelley wrote this article in the Orange County Register, which if you ever want to read like reactionary...
Wait. Orange County Register, that has literally nothing to do with the city of Los Angeles. That is a totally different jurisdiction. Why? What is her horse in this race?
Well, let's not forget that Susan Shelley is the vice president of communications for the Howard Jarvis Tax Center, literally the most reactionary group in all of California, responsible for Prop 13 and opposing every good idea that we've ever seen. So I'm going to go ahead and lay into Miss Shelley here for her misunderstanding of the way government works, because this is like, for someone who's supposedly well-versed in the workings of government, she has absolutely a lot of misunderstandings about the way things work. So let's go ahead and lay into this. So Shelley starts off very strong. Quote, "Socialism has arrived in the United States, and it's living in an apartment building near you." You know what, Shelley?
Hell yeah.
I wish it did. I wish socialism was my next door neighbor. I would be super happy about that.
Newsflash to any of our listeners that haven't caught on yet, we are definitely both socialists.
I mean, I consider myself a communist, but at the very least a socialist. One is a path to the other. So if socialism moves in next door, I'm going to be cooking them some cupcakes and welcoming them to the neighborhood. But she continues, Los Angeles Councilman Mike Bonin is the latest politician to promote a policy based on the belief that privately owned apartments kind of belong to everybody, and the government's job is to distribute them fairly. All right, so let's go ahead and stop here, where nowhere in Bonin's proposal for a 2020 ballot measure,
tax, right?
Yeah, this is about the vacancy tax. But so nowhere in his proposal for the vacancy tax to be on the 2020 ballot does he claim that the government owns the apartments, right? It's just saying if an apartment is vacant for too long, we will tax you to keep it vacant. Like the landlord still owns it, and the landlord can choose to not rent it and just pay a tax. Like the same way that you can choose to not own a car and stop paying your car registration. So she dropping down a, or
you can choose to buy a very expensive luxury car and pay more in your vehicle registration, because this is how this works.
So dropping down a few more paragraphs, she continues, quote, "The cost of housing isn't the only cause of the complex problem that's generally called, quote, homelessness." And I'm not sure why she puts in square quotes there.
Hold
on.
No, I'm sorry. The quote
that
homeless.
Is.
You're no. I.
She continues, but set that aside. Politicians who put on a show of anger and call for policies such as rent control and vacancy taxes are ignoring an important basic principle. So first off, yes, the cost of housing is the cause of homelessness. Like, that's one of the things that we keep coming back to is the number of chronically homeless people on the streets of American cities is going down and has since the first Bush administration. Like, that has been decreasing because we understand that we can deliver services to those people and get them into permanent supportive housing. The people who are caught out, the people who are becoming homeless, are people who work and can't afford apartments. Also, when she says put on a show of anger and call for policies such as rent control, like, I have yet to see Bonin flash any anger in this one. He was like, hey, we've got a lot of unused housing stock. Let's incentivize people to use that. Now, she continues in the next paragraph.
He gets angry about, but not this one. This one is just like frustration.
Oh, yeah. No. In the next paragraph, quote, private property doesn't belong to the government, and the government can't seize private property or tax the value out of it just because somebody else wants or needs it. Full stop. Yes, they can. It's called eminent domain. The government literally can and does do that. It does it all the time. That is literally a power granted to the government in the Constitution. It's right there in black and white on the parchment. Like, they can do that. They do that.
Man.
And they can tax whatever the hell they want.
Does she not understand how highways get built? Like, what the hell?
And here's the funny thing is sometimes eminent domain gets used to fund private interests. Like if a developer wants to build a hotel in a seaside in Connecticut, they can literally have the government seize that property for them, which they did. And our Supreme Court found that is perfectly constitutional. So Miss Shelley needs to go back and like read the Constitution again and brush up on like Civics 101
civics course. Yeah,
because like the government can and does do these things all the time. Next paragraph, quote, if the government could do that, they do that, and they can do that, but I digress. It could also tax people for having empty bedrooms in their homes or even for unused money in a savings account. The premise is the same. One person's need is a claim on everybody else's property. So like, okay, here's the thing is you get taxed on the interest you earn on your savings account. Like that does get taxed as income. So like, again, that is something the government does. Unless you put it in like a Roth IRA or a specially structured tax shelter account, the government taxes the money that you're earning in your savings account. So again, this is a woman who influences government policy. Just remember that, folks. No. She literally influences government policy and doesn't understand the basics of how the government operates.
She helps run a tax organization, folks. A tax organization. Actually, let me rephrase that. She helps run an anti-taxes of any kind organization because they literally just oppose everything straight up. Like there's no tax. They're like what's his name? The guy that like runs around and makes everybody that's Republican.
Grover Norquist, who goes to Burning Man, by the way. Guy. Another reason I dislike Burning Man.
Wait, what?
Oh yeah, him and the founder of Burning Man were like really good friends because Burning Man has always had like a very libertarian tint to it. Yeah, no, I'm not going to get into that because I could go off on the ecological disaster that is Burning Man, plus all the like rape and sexual harassment that happens there. But we'll save that closer to Burning Man time. But to continue in the next paragraph, quote: in a free country, it is not the government's job to go around determining who has more than they need and who needs more than they have, and then redistributing everything through taxation or other methods of government force. So first off, that's how progressive taxation works. The government does do that. It should do that.
It's literally
redistributing income through the tax system is literally why we have progressive taxation and how we keep society from collapsing in on itself. And we're doing a terrible job at it, which is why the top 1/10 of 1% has made all of the money since 2008.
I don't understand where she's coming from.
She's coming from the OC. That's where she's coming from. She continues, quote, that's called collectivism. It's the idea that everything in society belongs to everybody, and the government's role is to make outcomes of everybody's decisions work out in a way that is fair and equal. I'm not even going to touch that one because it has no basis in the market-based incentives that is a vacancy tax.
It's not that hard, folks. It's really like this is like the minimal impact way of dealing with the situation. It's like Would you rather pay a little bit more of a tax in order to keep your rental unit that could otherwise be rented out? Like, do you want to pay more to keep that off the market, or do you want to pay more in other taxes to take care of all the homeless people that you're not supporting because you're a greedy asshole?
So she continues, skipping a paragraph
no.
down. Well, hold
Come on,
this
dude.
This is going to be a painful journey, but skipping down a paragraph. Quote, this is beyond the kind of general
thought we were
taxation that
done.
pays for a safety net. This is a punitive targeted tax aimed at people who are in the business of rental housing, and it might drive them right out of it. So, okay.
Go
yes,
for it. Get out of the business. If you don't want to be in it, get out.
But also the other thing is, this is exactly to pay for the safety net. Like, that's where the vacancy tax revenue would go.
Yes.
Is to the
Exactly.
safety net. And also, like, she just said that she hates taxes in general, so I'm not sure why she's standing for the safety net. But even beyond that,
No.
saying it's a punitive
She's from
targeted
Howard
tax,
Jones
like,
Tax Foundation.
it is. It's a punitive targeted tax in the same way that we have other punitive targeted taxes. Like,
Yeah, like on cigarettes.
Yes, and like trying to like get people to behave
Things that
differently
are
by
bad for
incentivizing
public
them
health.
to do something
you tax
different.
them more. Exactly.
And also, here's the thing is where she's like, it might put people out of business in the rental housing market. Well, they could just rent the unit for money. Like, they would get
Engage
money
in the
for renting
business,
it. They wouldn't
folks.
rent it for free. They would just get money for renting the unit. It might be less than they want. Right? But they'd still be getting money for that, which is still a net benefit over paying money for having something sitting empty.
Yeah.
She then continues, quote, other cities are trying similar policies. Voters in Oakland approved a vacant property tax in November. A property that is, quote, not in use for 50 days or more each year is subject to a fee of $6,000 per parcel, with the money going to fund homeless services, new
super
affordable housing,
reasonable.
and the reduction of blight. Now, I don't know what that has to do with like the vacant homes tax, because it's not really the same, but it also shows that these kind of taxes are popular with voters. So that's good to know come November 2020. Continuing
Let's
on
do
that
it.
same thought, she says, quote, but some property owners say they'd be happy to build on the vacant land if the local government didn't make it prohibitively expensive to do so. She continues, one landowner who's growing potatoes on the site he bought with a plan to build a duplex said Oakland City officials told him city permits for the building would cost $35,000 and take a full year to process. She provides no evidence for that. She just says a guy told her that. There's no
Cite your
evidence. There's no
sources, folks.
documentation. She's just taking this
Cite 'em.
dude at his word. So we can totally trust that, because why would you produce evidence when you're making a really bold, ridiculous claim like that? Let's even assuming that that's true. Even assuming that's true, this guy is talking about a $5 million build for a duplex, and he's complaining that $35,000 is too much for permits. Just, he's got millions of dollars to drop on a duplex build, including all of the stuff that would have to go into prepping a vacant lot for that kind of building, but like 35 grand is too much? I'm sorry. All right. She continues. We'll drop down another paragraph.
No, stop. How much longer is this going to go on?
We're getting towards the end. Quote, another factor in the housing crunch is the state's policy discouraging development in outlying areas where land is more affordable. Because of the belief that California must, quote, lead, scare quotes on lead for some reason, on climate policy. Hold on, she explains, lead is in quotation marks because nobody is following, which FU, everyone in the country follows our CAFE standards. California increased fuel efficiency standards, and every state did the same thing because the
literally
car
run the
makers
show on
literally
this.
made it happen because they realized California's the biggest California's the biggest car market in the nation.
We are also the biggest housing market because
We are.
reasons, but yes.
And
Because
as she
everything
continues,
market.
Well, and as we are the leader in everything, but I digress.
Yes.
As she continues, the state frets over a metric
Sadly,
called,
also the
quote,
leader in
vehicle
homelessness.
miles traveled. If the environmental
Yeah.
impact report for a proposed housing project finds that people will likely drive long distances to work, the whole project can become infeasible because we don't want people driving a lot because it burns carbon, because it puts emissions into the air, because it's bad for the environment. It creates traffic. Cars
And because
create
it
a
sucks
lot of
for people to be
waste.
stuck in traffic for like 3 hours a day commuting each way. Like, stop it. Just stop
that
it.
actually-
What?
Long commutes increase the number of car accidents and actually shorten your lifespan. So yes, the
And
state
increases
has a
the risk
vested
of
interest.
domestic violence. That is definitely
Yeah.
a thing that there have been studies about, and it is true.
The state has a vested interest in making sure that you're not caught in traffic too much for a number of reasons. But her whole screed against we shouldn't care about the environment is just kind of an amazing one, especially when we know that cutting down car trips is good for everyone. That's not even debated. And the fact that she's I can't believe the government would measure a thing that has an impact on people's lives. What does the government think it's here to do? Protect the general welfare, as it says in the effing Constitution. All right. Last two paragraphs here. Don't worry, Chris. The pain will be over here soon.
Come on, man.
No, last two paragraphs. They're short. So, quote, other factors in the tightening market include the growing use of units as short-term rentals on services such as Airbnb and a significant amount of foreign investment, especially from China, in residential real estate.
Ban it, too.
Taxing vacancies won't fix any of that, but politicians are short-term thinkers, and long-term damage is somebody else's problem. If they rented these jobs, they'd never get their security deposit back. Joke's on you, Susan. Nobody gets their security deposit back. But here's the other thing. Vancouver showed us that using a vacancy tax cuts
literally
down
fixes
on
all of these
investment in your residential market. That was literally who was targeted, was investment firms from China buying up residential real estate and then not renting it.
Somebody didn't do their homework.
Well,
Somebody
of course
just straight up didn't do their homework.
Of course not. If the Howard Jarvis Tax Center did their homework, we wouldn't have Prop 13. If the Howard Jarvis Tax Center did their homework, they would be like, oh no, taxes are good and how we pay for society. But instead, we have Susan Shelley here who just babbles nonsense, outright lies throughout the course of her piece, and for some reason gets published in the Orange County Register, who I guess just doesn't have editors, at all.
Or if they do have editors, they just don't have any editorial standards.
I mean, it's just an insane amount of babble that she put out here, and all of it easily disproven by just a couple of minutes on Google.
But by the way, the whole thing where she's talking about the vacancy taxes aren't going to have any impact on short-term rentals. No, bullshit. What happens if you choose to just not count short-term rentals as actually using the property for the intent that it has when it was established as a long-term rental, the way it was supposed to be marketed? If you charge a landlord a vacancy tax because you say, nah, if you're just doing short-term rentals, that doesn't actually count as fulfilling the vacancy. It is not filled. It is not a long-term rental. Therefore, we're going to continue to charge you a vacancy tax. That will make the things like Airbnb, which are making such a massive impact in neighborhoods like Venice and across the rest of the city of Los Angeles, it will make those completely untenable. And that, frankly, is a good thing. Because you shouldn't be using short-term rentals like Airbnb on any long-term rental stock, because every single unit that you take off of the long-term rental stock and you put it toward a short-term rental, that is one family's housing rental that you are denying. That is one more shortage of rentals that we have available in the city, which is contributing in a very, very direct way to the current housing shortage and homelessness crisis that we're going through. And frankly, just,
yeah, no.
Yeah.
So
I'm lost for words here.
Yeah, no, we're going to come back and talk about some more of Susan Shelley's pieces in the future. I can just feel it. She is basically the anti-knock writer. Her and Jack Humphreyville are going to be rituals for us to draw from.
Jack Humphreyville, haven't read any of his pieces in a while.
We're gonna drag the boomers. It's gonna be so much fun. But this one, I've pretty much yelled myself out on this one. This is,
Henry
I
Kissinger.
think. Yeah, we'll move on to that one in a second. But I was going to say, I think this is not my most aggrieving journalistic malpractice I've seen this week. The SF Chronicle article that you sort of mentioned about the HUD situation.
Stuff, yeah.
That one, we'll post the link to that one so your jaw can just hit the floor, because watching reactionaries simply lie and still get published in major publications. I mean, I know there aren't a lot of pressure points for the folks that own the Orange County Register, but my Buddha, if you can just take a minute to read this stuff and write a very angry letter to them, it might get published. Susan Shelley, I wish you the best, and I hope you keep publishing because this is going to be so much free content for us to just draw from and mock you. If you want to avoid that, just stop writing
The
stuff.
listeners are just going to get really annoyed at the fact that I'm just sitting here laughing at the complete incompetence of this writer.
As Camus stated, absurdity is the first rule. And on that note,
Hooray.
let's talk real quickly about our what was the Deadspin? What was their
The Deadspin article's
that
title was,
again?
quote, Ancient War Goblin Henry Kissinger Defends Olympics in Los Angeles Times, end quote.
Yeah, so Henry Kissinger wrote an article in the LA Times op-ed section that's entitled, For a More Peaceful Vision of the Future, Look to the Olympics. And it
Nothing
is
like
quite...
listening to a war criminal tell you about peaceful visions of the future, folks.
And this one, like, I'm not going to go through paragraph by paragraph on this one, but it's an amazing hagiography of the Olympics that lies and elides the truth. He praises Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who is the guy who started the Olympics. He calls him a French educator and historian, which he wasn't. He was an aristocrat who didn't have a real job. De Coubertin also was a French nationalist who felt that the French were getting soft and weak and needed to be rebuilt through competition. He believed that women were too psychologically and physically frail to compete in these sorts of sports. And so he created the Olympics. He also elides the fact that like
Teddy Roosevelt shit here.
Oh yeah, and he elides the fact that like a lot of the Olympic ceremonies and traditions that we think about came out of Nazi fucking Germany. You know, the Torch Rally was created by the Nazis.
Yeah.
The whole March of
Thanks,
Nations
Hitler.
is very nationalistic. There are deep connections between the military-industrial complex and our Olympics machine. Deep connections between like physical, psychological, and sexual abuse of athletes, as we keep finding out more and more and more of. I'm looking at USC. I'm looking at University of Michigan. Apparently now I'm also looking at UCLA because I guess,
University of Michigan or Michigan State? I think it was Michigan State.
Oh, Michigan. Well, he was at both of them, but he was at Michigan State. But he treated he saw student athletes from both universities. UCLA also has apparently a sexual assaulting gynecologist, which like
Wait, we've got him at both of the schools?
Yeah, UCLA also had one because you can't have that intertown rivalry without, trying to one-up each other, I guess.
No.
But the one quote that I did want to highlight here before we move on to sort of wrapping this out was Henry Kissinger said, quote, I have now lived through 46 Olympic Games, and quite frankly, that's a travesty. Like Henry Kissinger should not have lived through 46 Olympic Games, at least not in freedom. Like if he's lived through 46 Olympic Games in the
20
Hague,
of them were in the Hague, yeah.
yeah, that would be the best.
Fair
but
enough.
you pulled a quote from
did pull
Deadspin
a
real
quote.
quick, and I think this
Yeah.
is just a really good note to end on.
Quote, long enough, too, that his continued existence feels almost like a kind of taunt. The man behind some of the most cynically conceived and brutally executed wars in human history, who instrumentalized and pursued power in the most transparently self-serving ways and at staggering human cost, has somehow stuck around long enough to be allowed to tell stories about unity and peace. End quote.
That's pretty much all you need to know about Mr. Kissinger and his opinions on the Olympics.
Why is he not dead yet?
And you know what, to tie a bow onto this one, when Henry Kissinger, a member of the International Olympic Committee, just goes to the Olympics, not to work, just to visit the Olympics and like be there while the Olympic Games are happening, he gets a per diem of $900 a day. One day of him sitting around eating fruit plates at the Olympics earns him more money than you probably make in a week at your job before or after taxes. Amazing. I don't have too much to report on right now as far as like stuff to do. I know there's going to be a lot of stuff coming up next week in LA. Keep an eye on Ground Game. We've got our weekly team assemblies every Thursday evening in Hollywood, starting at 7:30. You can hit up the
Not this week,
Facebook.
though. This week's gonna be
Sorry,
4th
you can
of
hit up
July,
the.
so.
Oh, that's right. It is the 4th of July.
Yeah.
I keep forgetting that. I don't really pay a lot of
We're gonna
attention
take
to
a day
national holidays. Yeah, I'm a
Go
bigger fan of
barbecue
Bastille
and
Day.
have some beer, folks. Yes, fair enough. That's totally fair.
But other than the 4th of July, you can always catch Ground Game in Hollywood Thursdays at 7:30 in the evening. Please drop by, see what we're up to. We'll also be publishing our calendar. We've kind of been doing a website refresh, so more and more stuff is going to be coming online. You can always hit up knock.la to see the amazing stuff that's being published.
There's so much content this last week.
Yeah, an article by Spike Friedman, who is our editor-in-chief, and also at the Luskin School of Public Policy. He wrote a really good one about services, not sweeps. We've had a bunch of really good stuff coming out lately. Jacob Wucher continues to just spit fire on housing issues across L.A. and earning the ire of reactionaries who continue to claim that, we're funded by AHF and we're some, nefarious dark money group, which, looking at my bank account, I kind of, God, I wish I was a dark money funded billionaire, because that would probably be different than fighting for justice and being broke. But given the choice, I'd rather be broke and fighting for justice. So Chris, go ahead and take us out.
As always, if you guys have any events that you want us to publicize, take part in, or generally be made aware of, please visit our website at www.groundgamela.org. or visit our Facebook page and send us a message there, or go ahead and just send an email over to us at podcast@groundgamela.org. And as always, thank you very much for listening. We genuinely support, we appreciate all the support from you guys, and we wouldn't be able to do this without it. So hit us up. We've got an ActBlue account now instead of our CrowdPack account that had been shut down because CrowdPack is apparently no longer in business. But if you hit us up on Ground Game LA on Twitter, you'll find a quick link over to our ActBlue site. And every dollar that you donate does a huge amount to keep us going. That's how we pay the rent. It's how we keep doing this stuff and keep organizing and bringing the fight to the folks at City Hall and the Board of Commissioners and the Sheriff's Department Oversight and the Police Department Commissioners and all these other places that we're showing up all the time. Kick us a donation, please. We're going to just keep begging.
Yep. And, as Joe Hill said, don't spend no time mourning, organize. Y'all have yourselves a great week.
Absolutely. Thanks. Bye.
Solidarity net. Thirty more.